One of my biggest fears about Americans is that we don't study history and we don't know the lessons of history. I think we have to go against the grain and look at other versions of American history, but also don't just study American history. We have to study earlier history, and we have to study diplomatic and military history. And at least in most universities, especially the elite universities, diplomatic and military history is not popular. It's been pushed to the sidelines, but it's very important for people to study that.
Today on Compendium, it is my distinct honor to have military historian and classicist Barry Strauss on the show. Barry is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor emeritus at Cornell University. He's written some great books, 10 Caesars, Masters of Command, The War That Made the Roman Empire, and his newest one is Jews versus Rome, about 200 years of violence and revolt in Israel under Roman rule, and how Israel was sort of between two massive empires, the Parthians on one side and the Romans on the other, and how that led to revolt after revolt after revolt. We talk about the new book here on the episode, but we also get into some grand strategy and some great commanders throughout history. Hannibal, Julius Caesar, we'll touch on the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, and what made some of these great commanders so great. Plus, we'll talk about some of the fascinating figures in Barry's new book, maybe some great figures that you haven't heard of. So without any further ado, Barry Strauss.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Barry Strauss, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Your newest book is Jews versus Rome. I think this was such an interesting topic to cover, and I was very curious. This is, and you note this in the forward of the book, this is a well-traveled topic, and yet you approach it differently than it's been done before. What about this was so interesting that you thought you could bring something new to it, or perhaps was something that we could explore a little bit differently through a different lens or something like that?
Great question. If I had to say it briefly, I would say two things: geopolitics and the Iranian connection. So one of the things that really fascinated me about the subject and struck me about the subject is that, well, as the title of the book in a way is misleading, it's Jews versus Rome, but what actually interested me was the fact that it's Jews versus Rome plus the Iranian connection. At this time in history, Iran was an empire called Parthia. It was ruled by a dynasty that came from Parthia, which is in what is nowadays northeastern Iran. And far from being an enemy of ancient Israel, Judea as it was called at the time, Parthia was a friend, an ally, a would-be partner against Rome. And Judea was not only on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, but it was actually caught between two empires, between the Roman Empire, in the Roman Empire, but also constantly looking towards the Parthian Empire to the east. So I wanted to use that lens to look at this conflict, and also to look not only at the most famous part of it, the Great Revolt, the Jewish War chronicled by Josephus. Its most famous incident is Masada, but also to look at two later revolts, because I think that only by seeing these three revolts together can we get the full picture of the geopolitics of the time and how important the Iranian connection was.
So I'm going to assume that most people listening and watching this are very familiar with the Roman Empire, and they might be a little bit familiar with the Parthian Empire. But for those who may not be fully dialed in on Parthian history, give us like a brief understanding of what the Parthian Empire was and how much of a rival it was to the Romans.
Great question. Parthia was the only remaining rival empire in the Roman sphere. I mean, there are other peoples that the Romans found troublesome: the German tribes, the Caledonians in what's now Scotland, the Nubians in what's now Sudan. But only the Parthians had any claim to having an empire the way the Romans did. The Romans wanted to defeat the Parthians, but they failed again and again, at least up to this point in history. So the Parthian Empire, which arose in the 3rd century BCE and was now at its height, it stretched from Syria, from the Euphrates River in eastern Syria, all the way to the Stands, if you will, to Central Asia. And its heartland was both Iran and Iraq. Most of the time, the capital was in Iraq, in a place called Ctesiphon, or which was near modern Baghdad. There was also a capital in Iran, and Parthia was very wealthy. It dominated the trade route, the Silk Road, if you will, from the Far East all the way to the Mediterranean. The Parthians were a military people. They were famously good horsemen, and they did defeat the Romans in a battle that really bothered the Romans when they look back on it, the Battle of Carrhae in the 1st century BCE, where they crushed the Roman army and killed the commander. And briefly, also in the 1st century BCE, they conquered Syria, part of what's now Turkey, southern Turkey, and what's now the Holy Land. They conquered that as well. And for a brief period of several years, Judea was a Parthian ally rather than a Roman ally. So a powerful empire, and one that the Romans were always concerned about, either worried about the Parthians reconquering some of the Near East from the Romans, or dreaming of conquering the Parthian Empire themselves. So always in the Romans' minds.
Yeah, and my understanding of the Romans is that there's almost this innate, they can't stand a rival, and that's probably good geopolitically, but there's also seems to be something in the carrots and sticks about what constitutes a Roman and how they do diplomacy, that they just can't suffer any potential enemies. And not to spend too much time on the Parthians, but they are in some ways to me fascinating because, unlike the Carthaginians that we tend to know a decent amount about,
Mhm.
the Parthians don't get a ton of time in the history books, perhaps because they're not a Western centric empire, and perhaps because they're a bit more Persian, even after the Persians held power there. But is there a little bit of a underestimating, perhaps, on the Romans' part of what the Parthians are? I know there's Crassus that you mentioned, the Battle of Carrhae. There's the way that I learned about it, that there was a bit of an underestimating by Crassus, and maybe that's a symptom of Rome as a whole, or maybe I misunderstood that.
No, you're absolutely right. Both that the Romans did not brook rivals, and all their instincts over their history was a potential rival on the horizon had to be knocked down, because that potential rival could become an invader. And also you're right that the Romans tended to underestimate the Parthians. Crassus is, one great example of a Roman general who thought this will be a cakewalk. I can, easily invade the Parthian Empire and conquer them, and he's destroyed. Mark Antony also, a little bit later, about 20 years later or so, also invades the Parthian Empire. Julius Caesar had been planning to do so when he was assassinated, and Antony picked up Caesar's mantle and invaded the Parthian Empire, and also faces a brutal defeat. So yes, there is a tendency to underestimate the Parthians. That being said, the Romans do a pretty good job of keeping the Parthians out of the Roman realm. When a Parthian prince invades Roman territory in the chaotic period following the assassination of Julius Caesar, and as I said, it conquers Syria, part of what's now Turkey, and Judea. Within 3 years, the Romans have driven him out, killed him, and reconquered all of those areas. And later on, the Romans do manage to conquer part of Parthia. But again, there's underestimation. Trajan, the emperor in the 2nd century of our era, invades Parthia, conquers Iraq all the way to the Persian Gulf, only to see an insurgency rise up and drive the Romans out completely, within a year of his conquest. So, yes, underestimation on the whole.
There is a character that you give ample page time to, and he's somebody that maybe the average Joe knows about. Maybe if you went to church a couple times, you would have heard the name before. But Herod is somebody that I think is incredibly fascinating, and he may not get some of his due, historically speaking, because he's kind of a client king.
Mm-hmm.
But as you point out in the book, he's an incredibly powerful character, and he's also playing along with some of these household names: Caesar Augustus, Mark Antony, Cleopatra. He would know all of these people,
Right.
and rub elbows with them. So tell us a little bit about Herod and his role in this entire story.
Sure. Herod, as you say, is fascinating. He was an evil man, but also a great man. Someone like Stalin comes to mind. So Herod squared the circle. He managed to find the magic formula, so he thought, to bring the Jews and Rome together in a happy marriage. And the way he did it was to be Jewish to his fellow Jews and to be Roman to the Romans and Greeks to the Greeks. So in Judea, he builds 3 temples to Augustus, the first Roman emperor, one on the coast, one in Samaria, and one in the north at the foot of Mount Hermon. He also builds 2 new cities, and he's not subtle about what he calls them. One located in what's now the West Bank near modern Nablus is called Sebaste, which is Greek for Augusta. And the other one on the Mediterranean coast is called Caesarea, Caesar City. Caesarea Maritima, Caesar City by the sea. And that's a great new port with a very impressive, in engineering terms, impressive artificial harbor. And the high point of the city is a temple to Augustus. He also builds a hippodrome there, which can be used for races, athletic events, gladiatorial games, and indeed, once every 4 years, he puts on games in honor of the Battle of Actium, the battle in which Augustus won power. So in all those ways, he is pro-Roman and supporting paganism. But he also supports Judaism in that he takes the temple in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, the second temple, the one that had been rebuilt after the return from the Babylonian captivity centuries earlier, and he rebuilds it as an absolutely magnificent structure with a whole complex of buildings around it on the Temple Mount, which he enlarges and builds a huge retaining wall for, part of which can still be seen today. And he makes it one of the most magnificent religious shrines, if not the most magnificent religious shrine in the Roman Empire. In fact, he gives Jerusalem its greatest period of prosperity until the 20th century. So he is a great builder. He's also a Hellenophile. He loves Greece and all things Greek. This is very useful politically because there's a substantial Greek-speaking population living in his kingdom in ancient Judea. And he surrounds himself with Greek intellectuals, Greek courtiers. He also becomes a patron of the Olympic Games, and he actually goes to Olympia in Greece for an Olympic Games, where he's hailed as a patron of the Olympics. So he tries to be all things to all men. Very unpopular with some of his subjects, especially the religious Jewish ones. He knows it's unpopular, and so he builds a series of fortresses around his kingdom, and he also engages in persecution of his subjects. The Gospels famously talk about the slaughter of the innocents. We don't know. We have no other historical evidence to say whether that's true or not. It's certainly not out of keeping with Herod's character. But we have lots of historical evidence of the massacres he inflicted on the Jewish people in Judea during his reign and on his own family. He had his wife executed, or one of his wives. He had many wives. And he had his most talented sons executed on the suspicion that they were going to go against him. So when he died, the only heirs he had were kind of the B team. He didn't have the A team around anymore.
So you mentioned Stalin. That is a pretty interesting comparison because I was wondering in reading the book how much of the image of Herod that we have that comes down to us, how much of that is influenced by how he appears in the Gospels versus the historical record, or are they linked and braided together into one thing?
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. It's certainly influenced by the Gospels. You get just a completely negative picture in the Gospels. In the Talmud, also, you get an overwhelmingly negative picture of Herod as a persecutor. Um, Although the Talmud says, and yet he built this magnificent temple. But still, the picture that we get from both the Talmud and the New Testament is very, very negative. The picture that we get from the historical sources, and this is primarily Josephus, is more mixed, and it also emphasizes the positive things that he did. Likewise, archaeology, shows a lot of what he built at Caesarea and at Sebaste in the West Bank. Also at Hebron, Herod built a magnificent structure there, much of which still stands. And in Jerusalem, the retaining walls of the temple, the Second Temple, part of which is the famous Wailing Wall or Western Wall, they still stand, and their testimony to what Herod did. Also, one of the several towers that he built, still stands in part and can be seen today. So we get a different impression from those sources of Herod. It's clear that there were those who admired him. Augustus certainly admired him, got along very well with him, or he got along well with Augustus. And I think that largely the Jewish elite in Judea and some of the pagan elite in Judea also admired Herod, worked fine with Herod, got along with him. But a lot of the ordinary people despised Herod and what he had done.
Yeah, it seems like there's a bit of a realpolitik with him
Yes,
where he knows where his bread is buttered, and it's with Rome. And it
right.
seems that there's a couple times before Augustus really solidifies things where uh, he will pledge his allegiance one way, but then once the winds change, he goes, "Well, no, actually, I really always liked Augustus. He seems like a great
Yeah,
guy,"
yeah,
and he flips. But he seems, and you see this where the regular folks in Judea, there
right.
is a very stringent moral code,
Yes,
and there's no flexibility there and allowances for political maneuvering. And he seems to just be your classic political maneuvering sort of a guy, and in that sense has a capability for politics and what that would require. But is it possible that perhaps while he does do a few things that maybe don't look great, is it possible that there's a revisionist argument to be made that he's just a great political operator in a really hotbed place filled with a whole bunch of different ethnic groups, and there was just no winning?
yes, I think that's very perceptive. And there are revisionist historians who say that Herod was right, that Judea had no choice except other than to accept the fact that the Romans were there, and they had to compromise with the Romans, and that what Herod did to um, to believing Jews, Herod was desecrating the land by building pagan temples. And he even put on gladiatorial games in Jerusalem, which was major desecration of the land, as it were. But there were realists would say there's really no choice. We have to meet the Romans halfway. We might not like it, but survival requires that we do this, and let's focus on what's really important. So yes, and there are historians who say, if Herod had been followed by descendants of his political talent, then there never would have been Jewish revolts, and things would have continued peacefully. Myself, I'm a little more skeptical of that argument, but certainly there are people who make it.
Yeah, you do point out, and just sort of give the folks listening a broad paintbrush to sort of give the image of how potentially politically difficult this kind of a job ruling this area is, because as you point out in the book, there's a lot of different people with different beliefs that are foremost in how they live their lives. And the way you describe it in the book, it would have been really difficult for anybody except some of those that were really adept politically at playing the different factions and playing them against each other.
Yeah. Yes, a great question. It was very difficult to rule. So here we have this country that's ethnically divided. So you have the Jews, and the Jews themselves are divided in different groups, different factions, different kinds of belief, with substantial minorities thinking that the temple and the priests who run the temple are illegitimate. So there is that. You also have class divisions between the very wealthy and most people are poor. So there's that. Then you have non-Jewish groups. You have, first of all, the Greek speakers who dominate most of the cities in the region. They themselves probably are of mixed ethnic origins, some from Greece and Macedon, some Syrians, some earlier Canaanites / Philistines who are now speaking Greek. And they're pagans, and they don't necessarily get along with their Jewish neighbors. Then you have, in what's now the northern West Bank in Samaria, you have the Samaritans. The Samaritans, like the Jews, follow the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but they do not accept the legitimacy of the temple in Jerusalem or the priesthood. They have their own priesthood and their own temple on Mount Gerizim, located near modern Nablus. In the center / south of the country, you have the Idumeans. Herod himself is Idumean on his father's side, and actually his mother is an Arab. The Idumeans had migrated from what is now Jordan to central / southern Israel centuries earlier. In the 2nd century BCE, they had converted to Judaism. Whether they converted by force or voluntarily is debated among historians. But they now considered themselves Jewish, although they were a somewhat different ethnic group. And then in the extreme north and the extreme south of the country, you had Arabs who were also pagans of different sorts. So to rule this country, you've got to rule all those different people. But you also have to deal with the Romans, who are, now there. And you also have to deal with the Parthians, who are in the east, not very far away. And within Judea, there are certainly many Jews who think, we really wish we could have the Parthians as our overlords, not the Romans. Because, well, there's a long history of the Jews in Iran. Centuries earlier, in the 6th century BCE, when the Jewish elite when Judea had been conquered and the elite had been sent into exile in Babylon, it was a Persian king, Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, who liberated the Jewish exiles and allowed them to return to Judea to rebuild the temple. And for 2 centuries, Judea was a Persian province. So there are all these different things going on, all these different groups you have to appeal to. And I wouldn't say that many of them are dedicated to harmony. Far from it.
Would you say that the Parthian Empire follows in the footsteps of the Persians, and that the Persians were pretty ambivalent to what their different subjects did religiously, so long as it didn't cause trouble? The Romans in some ways are a bit like that, but there's different times in history where they get a little bit more stringent as they see religious factions causing trouble. But is there perhaps a wanting to be under the Parthian rule because, hey, we can practice religion the way we want to. There's going to be no interference. We don't have to worry about, fill in the blank, whatever thing they might be complaining about? Or is it perhaps a bit more complicated than that?
Well, yes, it's more complicated, but yes, there is that aspect to it, and um, it's not neither I think you said it exactly right. Both empires are willing to live and let live among their subjects as long as they're not politically a threat. So for the Romans are happy to take some gods from various people who they ruled and to bring them to Rome, to add them to the pagan pantheon. There are two exceptions. One is the God of Israel, and the other is the Druids in England and Britain. And the problem with those two gods is partly religious, but mostly political. And the fact that the Jews are looking towards Parthia and that the Druids, as the Romans see it, are engines of revolt against Rome. There's one other factor, and that is that um, the Parthians are Zoroastrians, and though they're not monotheists, they're closer to monotheism than Roman paganism is. And so the Romans would naturally, in vis-a-vis Judea, the Romans would naturally look at the Greeks and say, oh, these guys, they're pagans like us. Their gods are more or less the same as our gods. We're on the same wavelength, and they have no problem sacrificing to the emperor, whereas the Jews did. The Parthians would not be sympathetic to Greco-Roman paganism. They'd be much more sympathetic to Jewish monotheism. So there is a cultural affinity, cultural slash religious affinity there that is part of what's going on.
Interesting. What in and maybe broadly speaking through your research of this period, what's something maybe culturally, politically, or perhaps religious that you think a consequence of this period that you think deserves more emphasis than it tends to get in the historical record?
Well, that's a really good question. Historian, I'm a little bit stumped. Historians uh, certainly note that out of the events of, I mean, the first century of our era is one of the most consequential in history because it sees the beginnings of Christianity, and that arises from this turmoil. It also sees the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, which is has certain similarities with Second Temple Judaism, but in other ways is quite different from Second Temple Judaism. But I wouldn't say that people don't note that. I think people do note that. And I
Well,
think that,
let's put it this way, maybe. What's something that, as you're doing the research and collecting all the things, what's something that stands out to you and you go, that's really cool? And maybe something that draws you into the era and the narrative a bit more.
well, okay, so yeah, so one thing I think is there in the title of the book, Jews versus Rome. And another way to put it is uh, small nation state versus empire.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the issues at stake here. Um, you know, there are those who would say, what was the problem? The Romans were willing to tolerate the Jews. Why did the rebels have to come, these hotheads have to come and stir the pot and basically engage in activities that ultimately destroyed the Jewish nation in Judea or weakened it enormously? So there was only a remnant left, mostly in the north, mostly in Galilee and Golan. And I think the answer is, in a way, um, do you want to be a nation state, or are you content to be part of an empire? And the rebels were saying, in effect, there is only one ruler of this land, and that ruler is God, and his palace is the house of God on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. and that the Roman governor sitting in Caesarea on the coast is illegitimate and pagan. Now, you might say that is utterly unrealistic, and you can't. If you want to make that work and rebel, you are doomed to failure against the world's mightiest empire. Um, but you might also say that the dream is very important for Western civilization, and the dream of being a kind of a republic, a different kind of republic than we're used to thinking of in the Roman Republic, but a state that's dedicated to a kind of freedom. Um, it's very important to keep that alive in the Western tradition. I'm certainly not the first scholar to say that, for example, the American founders, through English political thought, or rather British political thought, in the early modern period, that one of the influences on them was not only Greece and Rome, but also ancient Israel. And this notion of a Hebrew republic, this notion of something that is connected to God and has its own might versus an empire, I think that's pretty important in the American way of looking at the world and the Western Republican way of looking at the world. So, the consequences of that were pretty disastrous for the Jewish people at the time, without any
Yeah.
question. These revolts were failures, and many, many, many people were killed or enslaved, and their way of life destroyed, their homes destroyed, their holy city, Jerusalem, destroyed. And yet, the legacy, the spiritual legacy, is not inconsiderable.
Are there any, maybe putting our grand strategy hats on here for a
Yeah,
second,
yeah.
is there any path where these revolts may have worked? I think probably your victory conditions are just create life so difficult for the Romans that they just wash their hands of it and they say, I've had enough.
Yeah.
Is that a feasible outcome, or is that something that's just probably never going to happen because it's too important a region?
Another great question. By far, the likeliest way for the rebels to win is to get help from Parthia. Either massive help, so there's a large Jewish diaspora population living in the Parthian Empire, mostly in Iraq, mostly in southern Iraq. Either getting massive help from them or help from the Parthian state altogether. That is the one road to victory, that the likeliest road to victory. And the analogy that I would make is the American Revolution, where the revolutionaries from the word go wanted to get French help, and they got it. But to get it, they had to prove to the French, A, that they were really serious about leaving Britain, and this wasn't a lover's quarrel or a cousin's quarrel, cousins' war between the Americans and their British cousins. And second, that they could win. And it was only when the second condition was met, when the rebels won the Battle of Saratoga, that the French said, okay, we're in. So for the Jewish rebels to have gotten that kind of help from Parthia, they too would have had to win a battle. They did win a first battle against the governor of Syria at the very beginning of the revolt, an old man named Cestius. But then the Romans came back with a younger, better general named Vespasian. And the Jews never had a big victory against him. So if they could have had that, and they brought the Parthians in, they could have won. That's the likeliest scenario for victory. The second scenario for victory, which is less likely in my opinion, is if the rebels could have united in Jerusalem and had a united front against the Romans and made the siege of Jerusalem fail, or so costly that the Romans would have had to give up, then the Romans might have agreed to a modus vivendi. It's been suggested by colleagues of mine, historians have looked at the period, that perhaps the Romans would have allowed the rebels to have a mini-state around Jerusalem while the Romans controlled the sea coast. I think that's less likely to have worked. I think if that had happened, ultimately the Romans would have come back and taken Jerusalem as well. They would have bided their time. And maybe even if the Parthians had helped, the Romans would have kept coming back, because that's what the Romans did. But they never got massive help from Parthia. They got a little help, but not very much. And they did not unite in Jerusalem. In fact, just on the contrary, they engaged in a civil war, killing each other and destroying the grain supply in Jerusalem, which made a Roman victory in a siege, if not inevitable, then at least likely. So neither of those two conditions was met. There's also speculation as to whether a guerrilla war could have worked. Perhaps it could have. The rebels did not engage in a guerrilla war. They did engage in a guerrilla war later on in the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s. That failed too, but it gave the Romans a very rough time. And in fairness, that revolt took place after there'd been so much destruction in Judea from the first revolt and then a second diaspora revolt, which cut off help from the diaspora. Perhaps a guerrilla revolt could have been more successful in that early period. But if, from the military point of view, the rebels did so many things wrong that it's just hard to see them succeeding.
So I got a question from a listener here, and you touched on this a little bit, but the Romans were big fans of adopting things that they saw worked in other places and molding it into the Roman way of life. Speaking in terms of religious practices, they adopted the Greek pantheon. Constantine, many years after this, will adopt Christianity with his own conversion to Christ. Why does Judaism just not work with the Roman way of life and pantheon at this time? And why does it never entertain perhaps that they would bring Judaism sort of into the Roman fold?
Well, great question, but in a sense, it did work. So Judaism was very popular in the Roman Empire, and there were many people. We don't know how many. We don't have good population statistics for anything except the Roman army. But there are so-called God-fearers, theoseboi in Greek. And these were pagans who were attracted to the synagogue and to Jewish practices such as charity. They did not become full-fledged converts, and conversion was more difficult in antiquity because Judaism was a nation as well as a religion. How do you convert to a nation? But they hung out in the synagogue, and they continued to do so even after they became Christians. In the 4th century, there's concern that Christians are hanging out at the synagogues rather than going to church. So on a certain level, Judaism is succeeding in the Roman Empire. And even so high a person as Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, is attracted to Judaism. There are things about Judaism that she likes without actually becoming Jewish. If I may take a really vulgar comparison, the pop singer Madonna's interest in the Kabbalah. There's something like that going on. That becomes much more difficult after the Jewish revolt, when the Jews are branded public enemy number one in the empire. But in a way, the second answer to that question is the way to do it is Christianity. And what the followers of Christ, as they called themselves originally, said is, you don't have to convert to Judaism. You just have to accept the God of Israel. And you can accept the God of Israel through Christ Jesus. And that, in a way, is what Paul's mission is about, or it's a major part of Paul's mission. So it makes it possible, not right away, but only in the long term, for the Roman Empire to become a Christian empire.
I want to pivot just a little bit here to command. You've written about what makes a great commander, and you've written about some of the great ones in history. And I'm curious, in your mind, what does make a great commander, and who are some of the figures in history who sort of embody that definition of what makes a great commander?
It's a great question. It's a little bit of a complicated question because it depends whether you mean a battlefield commander or a strategist. And also,
maybe let's go strategist, because I think tactics are pretty easy. Grand strategy can be a bit more difficult. So, in your mind, who are some of the better strategists as it sort of fits your observation?
Well, there are many great strategists. I mean, I think that um, Hannibal was a great strategist, but his strategy failed because he underestimated the enemy. Scipio Africanus, the man who defeated Hannibal for Rome, was a better strategist because he learned from his enemy's tactics, and in particular, he knew the importance of diplomacy and attacking the enemy's alliance. And he defeated Hannibal in large part because he weaned away the Numidian ally that in what is now Algeria, whose cavalry was essential to victory on either side. So that made him a very great strategist. Caesar was a great strategist, again, in part because he knew the importance of diplomacy. He knew the importance, when he conquered Gaul, of keeping his Gallic enemies divided. The Romans, in fact, never did have the motto divide and conquer. That comes later, but they practiced that without even having the motto, and Caesar practiced it very well. When he fought the Civil War, um, he was a great risk taker, but he was a strategic risk taker. He understood the order of things that he had to do. His main enemy, Pompey, fled Italy. He drove him out of Italy and went to Greece. But rather than attacking him in Greece right away, Caesar first turned westward and marched to Spain to defeat Pompey's allies, Pompey's armies in Spain, understanding that that was more important than defeating Pompey in the east, or that he couldn't dare turn eastward while that Spanish threat was waiting there. Augustus was not a great military man, but he was a great strategist. He certainly knew instinctively the Godfather's motto of keeping your friends close and your enemies even closer. When he and Mark Antony are vying for control of the Roman Empire, he marries his sister to Mark Antony, and she is a go-between, as it were, almost a spy in the enemy camp. It's been compared to mafia marriages nowadays, but that was very wise strategy. He also understood when it came to the final battle against Antony at Actium, he understood that Antony's game was to get him Augustus to leave his camp and fight in open field. And Augustus wisely refused to do that, and instead slowly starved the enemy out using his fleet. So that made him a great strategist as well. Um, you know, if we're going to go further into later periods, you know, again, the American revolutionaries, Franklin in particular, understood the importance of getting France on their side, and that this war was going to be won by keeping the Continental Army together and by getting the French on their side. And Washington was a great strategist insofar as he could keep the Continental Army together, which was politically the absolutely most important goal. He was a risk taker too. The fact that he turned around and crossed the Delaware on Christmas 1776, surprise attack on the British, on the Hessians in particular, and then the Battle of Trenton and Battle of Princeton, excuse me, also shows that he was very good at his game as what he was doing. Lincoln was a great strategist in that he understood that to defeat the South, you had to conquer it. And although he had this series of bad generals, he kept on going. He also, we might say, he understood the importance of politics. So he knew that the South, the Confederacy, just like the American rebel colonies, wanted to have outside aid. In their case, it was to have the aid of Britain and France. And he understood the importance of the issue of slavery in the rebellion. And in the beginning, he refused to attack slavery because he was trying to lure the South back in. Uh, but once he won a victory, and Antietam was enough of a victory that he could use it, he then issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And that pretty much ended any possibility of the British intervening on the side of the Confederacy. And the French were not going to intervene without the help of the British. So that was great strategy as well.
I think probably your foremost military strategy thinker now, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably Clausewitz, right? We can start there. Is it Clausewitz, or do you think that we probably gather much of our strategy from maybe other places and pull it all together?
Well, I would say that the big three are Thucydides, Sun Tzu, and Clausewitz. And that Clausewitz is probably the most accessible and the one who speaks to us most nowadays.
Well, so and you're talking about Lincoln, and the thing that always sort of rings true for him, and then you can make the easy parallel to Clausewitz, is Clausewitz always talks about that war being an extension of policy, that it's just an extension of whatever sort of political period you're living in, and that will dictate what sort of wars you end up fighting. In his case, he realizes, okay, this war that maybe we think we're going to have to fight is going to have to turn into something akin to what World War I turns into in order to actually get the political aim that we want.
Mhm.
This is where you mentioned Hannibal.
Uh,
This is where Hannibal is such an interesting figure.
yeah,
Obviously, he's not living at a time that has the benefit of reading Clausewitz,
right.
but where he's so fascinating is he is clearly tactically brilliant. He does appear strategically brilliant, and you're right, it doesn't work. What allowances do you make for a guy like that who essentially does what you're supposed to if you're going by the book? He does what you're supposed to do if you're going to win, and it doesn't work anyway. And how do you account for that
Yeah,
in the record?
yeah. Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think Hannibal had his problem was not being enough of a realist. But sort of in a way you can't blame him. So there are two aspects to that. The one sense he wasn't a realist is that he underestimated how strong Rome was and how strong the Roman alliance was. One thing he could have done is at the very beginning of this conflict said, we actually can't defeat the Romans, therefore we have to be subordinate to them. And therefore we have to accept the fact that our empire in Spain will always be limited and the Romans will be our overlords in a way. We have this power at their sufferance. I think that would have been very hard for him or the Carthaginians in general to accept at that time. But then I think what he would have to do is to say, the Roman alliance is stronger than the Carthaginian alliance. Both Rome and Carthage had allies. But the Roman alliance in central Italy is tied to the Romans by iron threads. And the only way to break it is to engage in the dull and painful work of besieging cities in central Italy. Hannibal didn't like sieges. He wasn't good at them. He'd failed, or he hadn't failed, but he had a very hard time in the siege of Saguntum in Spain. He'd personally been wounded in that siege, and he never really engaged in sieges in Italy. He much preferred maneuver warfare. So I think the really hard thing Hannibal would have had to say to himself is, in order to win this war, I have to change the Hannibalic way of war. I have to adapt. And I think that's very hard for countries to do. Those countries that succeed in war are often those that learn from the enemy. So Scipio Africanus changes the Roman way of war and adapts the Hannibalic way of war, and he does so very well. In World War II, the Allies learn from Blitzkrieg, and they adapt the German way of war. And the Germans actually had also already learned from World War One. They had some tactical success, but ultimately operational and strategic failure in 1918. But they'd already learned something from the Western Front and how to change things, and they adapted it and made it more operational, more successful, more modern, if you will, in World War II. The Allies had to learn from that and follow suit, and they did in spades. So that's one of the reasons they were successful. It was a precondition for their success. Hannibal never did that. He never changed the way he fought. And I think that's part of being a great strategist and a great general, is to make painful changes. I think we're
Mm.
witnessing it now with the American military. Is the American military learning the lessons of the war in Ukraine, the wars in the Middle East? Uh, is the American military adapting drone warfare rapidly enough? Are they applying AI to warfare? And then the scariest thought, is it really true that the Chinese are genetically modifying warriors? So you have these super warriors. I think that's probably science fiction at the moment, but it might not be science fiction always. And what is America going to do if that's on the horizon? So real big questions of adaptation. And militaries don't like to change because people make their careers
Yep.
um, based on things. The other way, caution, I must say, is um, I'm a skeptic of military revolutions. And I'm always reminding people that there are also people who make their careers by selling new, shiny new things and saying, this is the way, this is the way you're going to win a war. Just change everything. And you don't want to change everything. You have to keep certain basics. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So change and adaptation, but without throwing out the basics.
How often do you think strategists and commanders actually are able to adapt and change their strategy as the conditions allow? Um, you know, I think of a lot of examples where commanders have failed, um, but they might have had really good militaries at the time, and there's this sort of inexplicable defeat at the end of it where they're going, "I did everything correct. I mean, I did it all by the book, and I lost anyway. How did that even happen?" How often uh, have you found that strategists throughout history are actually able to do that difficult thing and change maybe some of the DNA culturally, perhaps is required? How often are they able to do some of those things?
Great question. I don't have any statistics for you, but my seat of the pants answer is that failure is more common than success. Um, it's very difficult for settled powers to change. So what we see often in history is you get these states on the fringes, and they learn from the established states, but haven't bought in to the establishment. They have nothing uh, at stake, and so they're willing to change. So, for instance, Macedon, which
Hmm.
learns from the military innovations that the geniuses of the Greek city-states invent, but their own city-states aren't that quick to adopt them, or can't do so as efficiently as the Macedonians do it, and they defeat the Greek city-states. Uh, Rome, which is on the fringes, but is able to learn the naval warfare from the Carthaginians, learns how to create legions. They get the phalanx from the Greeks and they get the legions from the Samnites. The Romans are very adaptable. That's one of the reasons for their success. But they're not always adaptable. And when in the later empire, the Germans, who've been on the margins of the Roman world, but many of them have fought in the legions, they've done business with the Romans, they've observed the Romans. Um, the Romans spend a lot of money on their military budget in the era that sees the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. But what they're not doing is they're not spending it on the right things. They're not spending it in the right ways, and they don't have the political pace to mobilize society in the way that their ancestors could have. So they're not really able to adapt to the Roman threat. One of the greatest historical examples is the Arab conquests of the Roman Empire and the Sassanid Iranian Empire. The Arabs completely destroyed the Sassanid Iranian Empire. Um, and oh, I'm sorry, that thing's
No,
ringing,
you're good.
but it'll
You're
go
good.
away. And I think I stopped it. Okay, the Sassanid Iranian Empire, and they conquer a large part of the Byzantine Empire, most of the Byzantine Empire. So um, that is a case of a fringe power that uh, has learned from the established powers, comes up with new ways of war, and the established powers just can't compete.
If we can do a bit of forward thinking here, we're doing a major departure, but if we look ahead at the next few years, and we'll close on this,
Yeah.
what do you think are some of these takeaways from how war is evolving and how strategy perhaps is evolving along with it, with the war in Ukraine, with some of the fighting that's happened in Palestine and in Israel?
Right. Well, clearly there are these technical developments, that technological developments that the United States or any power that wants to succeed has to take into account, and namely drones and AI. Those are the two major things. The nightmarish possibility of biological or chemical warfare, uh, and the need to defend the homeland. I mean, the success of the Iron Dome and the other defensive systems that the Israelis have is something that, so now the Trump administration is talking about having a golden dome in the United States, but also the success, the importance of surprise. And,
Mm,
um, uh, we've seen that again and again. So Hamas had a huge tactical success on October 7th, 2023, because they surprised the Israelis, and they surprised the Israelis because the Israelis were asleep at the wheel. So often this happens in history. You get information, but it just doesn't compute. It's not because you don't get advance warning what the enemy's doing, it just doesn't compute. So Stalin again, in World War II, he got lots and lots of warnings of what the Germans are doing. You couldn't hide the German buildup. But he said, nah, it's a feint. They're just trying to scare me. It doesn't compute. So the need to not fall into that it doesn't compute mentality. That's uh, one thing that we need to take into account. Um, the other thing, again and again and again, the importance of politics and the importance of history. One of my biggest fears about Americans is that we don't study history
mm,
and we don't know the lessons of history. If we do study history, it's only American history. And nowadays, it's a very politicized version of American history. I think we have to go against the grain and look at other versions of American history, but also don't just study American history. We have to study earlier history. And we have to study diplomatic and military history. And at least in most universities, especially the elite universities, diplomatic and military history is not popular. It's been pushed to the sidelines, but it's very important for people to study that. Because if you want to succeed in war, gadgets are not enough. You have to see the big picture. You have to see the importance of allies, also tremendously important, and of political unity. And the only way to get that, I think, is to study history.
mm. So, aside from the Barry Strauss backlog, I've
Right.
got a lot of folks who'll be listening to this who are readers. So, if
Uh-huh.
you had just off the top of your head a couple writers, a couple thinkers, maybe even a couple books that folks should go check out and maybe get themselves down that road.
So I'm going to start with my Hoover Institution colleagues, and there's so many of them who've written great books. But Stephen Kotkin, his 2 volumes of his biographies of Stalin are fantastic. Um,
Incredible. Yeah.
yeah, Neil Ferguson and all of his many books, really important to learn from them. Um, Particularly his books about finance, the Sinews of War, his book on empire, also it's against the grain, really very important. Victor Davis Hanson, my colleague, fellow military historian and classicist, all of his books. I love his first breakthrough book, The Western Way of War, Carnage and Culture. It's a great book on the Peloponnesian War called A War Like No Other. And then his book on the Second World War, which I think is called The Second World War, is also a terrific book. Andrew Roberts, another Hoover Fellow who's written so many books. I love his biography of Churchill is just outstanding. and his biography of Napoleon, also
Mm-hmm.
outstanding. Josiah Ober, an ancient historian, his book Mass and Elite and Athenian Democracy is a fundamental book. Dan Edelstein, his recent book about revolutions, French Revolution and why it's different in earlier revolutions, is a great book to learn from. And those are just my Hoover Institution colleagues. There's a guy named Elliot Cohn, who actually is a political scientist, but he's an honorary historian. And he's written a number of books. He's got a great historical one about the war pathway between the British and the French in North America that goes through the Hudson River to Lake Champlain to Montreal. I forget what that's called, but that is a terrific book, and a book on leadership that's very important. And his great book on strategy is going to come out within the next year.
Oh, great.
So, and Walter Russell Mead has written a number of terrific books. He has a book called The Ark of the Covenant, ARC. I think it's called something like that. It's about Americans in the Middle East, starting in the 18th century. So I think that's a terrific book. John Lewis Gaddis, a historian of the Cold War, his history of the Cold War, but also he has a book on grand strategy that's really excellent. Edward Luttwak, a number of his books I really like. I'm fond of the grand strategy of the Roman Empire, but he has a book on strategy as well. How's that?
That's great. I'm going to go back and watch this, and I'm just going to start taking notes because that's fantastic. Several of those I've read, several I'm unfamiliar with. So that's great.
Condoleezza Rice, the director of the Hoover Institution, a political scientist, but all of her books are worth reading. And Barbara Tuchman.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah.
She's incredible.
The Guns of August is a wonderful book. So yeah.
Amazing.
So a lot of wonderful books out there.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you so much for the book recommendations at the end. I know lots of folks will appreciate that. I appreciate that quite a bit. And again, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Again, thank you so much to Barry Strauss for coming on the show. You can grab his newest book, Jews versus Rome, wherever you get your books. You can also go back and look at the Barry Strauss back catalog, and there's a lot of other great books in there as well. If you want to support me and what I'm doing here with Compendium, or if you happen to watch a clip and come here from someplace else, if you want to support what I'm doing all over the place, all over the internet, the best way to do that is on Substack. We've got a book club over there where we read and talk through great books. So if that sounds intriguing to you, you can support my work and also join the book club. It's kind of a two birds, one stone sort of a value proposition. So if that sounds great to you, go ahead and check that out. I'll have a link for that in the description below. And thank you all for listening, watching, rating, reviewing, all the things. I really appreciate it. Have a good one, everybody.